Hello. I'm going to read the Passion narrative, but I'm going to read it from Who, which is a book published by the Bible Society and written by Paul Langham, who is vicar of Christchurch, Clifton, and a good friend. And it's one of those brilliant translations which brings it idiomatically to life and also explains the cultural situation, which seems so confusing when we read the Passion narratives at times. It's a doorway in, and I hope that you're able to follow this and the drama. We're going to put this up onto the internet so that you can start it or stop it whenever you wish. Well, let me begin. And it begins in the middle of Holy Week, that week when Jesus was in Jerusalem and the tensions were mounting up. In the middle of the week, Jesus told his followers, "The Passover festival is just 2 days away. That's when I'll be crucified. This festival celebrates the great deliverance of the Jews from slavery in Egypt, when Moses led them to freedom. The religious authorities, intent on killing Jesus, were still racking their brains to come up with some means of having him arrested. They met together in the palace of Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, to go over their plan. Let's avoid the feast," they said, "or there'll be a riot." Well, one evening, Jesus was invited to dinner by a Pharisee named Simon. In those days, people leaned at a low table to eat, with their legs and feet stretched out behind them. A local woman, notorious throughout the town for the life that she lived, learned that Jesus was there. During the meal, she came in, bringing an alabaster jar of expensive perfume. Standing directly behind Jesus, she began to weep so that her tears fell upon his feet, and she then knelt and wiped away her tears with her own hair and kissed his feet. Then she broke the jar and poured its contents over his feet and head. The other guests, including Jesus' followers, began to mutter under their breath, "What a shocking waste! Think of all the good that she could have done with that sort of money. She should have sold it and given the money to the poor." They began to speak harshly to her, and Simon was thinking, this Jesus can't be from God if he lets this type of riffraff defile him. "Let her be," said Jesus. "Why are you all attacking her? You've no idea what this means to me. The state of the world means that you can spend the rest of your lives helping the poor. But this woman knows I don't have long to live, so she has come here to prepare me for the grave. Wherever the good news of God's kingdom is told, she'll be remembered for this." Turning to Simon, Jesus said, "I have a question for you. Imagine two men, both in debt to a local loan shark. One owes 500 and the other 50, and neither can repay their debt. So, guess what? He cancels both their debts. Now, which of the debtors will be most grateful?" Simon answered cautiously, "Well, I suppose it must be the one who was released from the biggest debt." "Spot on, Simon," replied Jesus. "You see this woman when I arrived for dinner. You ignored all the normal acts of hospitality and welcome. You didn't even offer me water to wash my feet. She used her own tears. You gave me no kiss of welcome. She has covered my feet with kisses. Where was the oil from my host to anoint my head for dinner? A stranger, not even one of the other guests, has provided it out of her own pocket. So great is her sense of gratitude for all that God has done for her. So I tell you, no matter how colourful her past, no matter how poor her reputation, from this moment all her sins have been wiped clean. And just as she wiped away her tears from my feet, sadly, it's very hard for anyone who thinks that they have no need of forgiveness to feel grateful. The guests who had been watching this exchange began to murmur among themselves. "Who does he think he is, to tell people their sins are forgiven?" Turning to the woman, Jesus said, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." For Judas, one of the inner circle of the 12, this was the final straw. God's enemy had been worming his way into his mind for some time, and now he went to the authorities and told them that he was ready to betray Jesus. They couldn't believe their luck and promised to pay him handsomely. He settled for 30 pieces of silver. From that moment, Judas bided his time, waiting for his opportunity. On the first day of the Passover celebration, Jesus sent Peter and John into Jerusalem to finalize preparations for their meal. "You'll see a servant carrying water to a house," he said. "Follow him and tell the owner that I need to use the large furnished room that you will make ready for us to celebrate with my friends." They went off and found it just as Jesus had told them. That evening, as he was eating with his 12 closest followers, Jesus said, "I have been looking forward to this moment for a long time. It will be the last time that I share a Passover, a meal, or drink wine again until my death and resurrection have ushered in the kingdom of God." Then he dropped a bombshell. "One of you here is going to betray me." He told them, "I must follow the path laid out for me, but the one who betrays me is heading for disaster. It would be better for him never to have been born." His followers were horrified, and each one in turn protested his innocence. "Surely you don't mean me?" Even Judas had the nerve to ask whether he was the one. Jesus said simply, "Yes, you are." That led to bickering about which of them was the most important, and Jesus said things in God's kingdom are upside down. In this world, leaders and rulers ride roughshod over the people, claiming it's for their own good. But in God's kingdom, the most important person is the one who serves everyone else. Who is more important in this world, the hotel guest or the waiter? The guest, of course. Follow my example and serve one another. You have stood by me, so I'm making you citizens of God's kingdom, where you will feast to your heart's content and also help me to judge the people." Then he took a piece of bread and gave thanks to God. As he broke it and shared the pieces among his followers, he said, "This is my body, which will be broken for you. Just like this. Eat it to remember me." Then he passed around the cup of wine, again giving thanks to God. "My blood will be poured out like wine, sealing God's unbreakable promise to all who trust in him. My blood will be shed for many, so that all wrongdoing may be forgiven." Then he said to them all, "The last time I sent you out on a mission, I told you to take nothing with you. But now, bring anything to hand. It's almost time. The ancient prophecies predicted that I would be counted a criminal, and you'll see it happen with your own eyes." His followers replied, "We've got a couple of swords." "More than enough," said Jesus. They sang a hymn together and went out into the night, and Jesus led them to the Mount of Olives, a hillside outside the city. "This very night," he warned them, "you're all going to desert me." Fulfilling the ancient prophecy, "I will kill the shepherd and scatter the flock." "But when I rise from the dead, I will see you in Galilee." "You can count on me," said Peter. "No matter what the others do, I'll never abandon you." "Oh, Peter, Peter," Jesus sighed. "How little you know yourself. The enemy has you in his sights and will do everything to break you. I'm praying that your faith will bring you through. When you're back on course, strengthen the others." And Peter said, I'm ready for anything, even if it means prison or death." "Peter, Peter," Jesus said again, "before the first cock crows tomorrow, you will deny all knowledge of me, not just once, but 3 times. "Never," swore Peter. "I'd sooner die than abandon you." And they all said the same. Leading them into the garden called Gethsemane, Jesus told his disciples, "Wait here, I need to pray for a while." And taking Peter, James, and John deeper into the garden, Jesus became visibly distressed and said to them, "I don't know how I'm going to get through what lies ahead. The very thought of it crushes me. Don't leave me on my own. Stay and keep watch with me." He walked forward and a few steps later collapsed to the ground. "Father," he cried out, "you can do anything. If there's any way out of this, please rescue me. But you know that my deepest desire is to fulfill your purposes. I'm ready to do whatever you ask of me." When he returned to his 3 friends, he found them all asleep. Waking Peter, he demanded, "Is 1 hour too much to ask? Stay awake and ask God for strength to resist the temptation you're going to face. I know your hearts are in the right place, but God's kingdom won't be built on good intentions alone. Don't let your resolve weaken." Leaving them once more, Jesus continued to pray. "Father," he cried, "if there's no other way, you know, I'm ready to go through with it. I'm yours to command." And when he had to wake his friends a second time, they were so ashamed that they could barely bring themselves to look at him. So he left them for a third time, continuing to pray fervently, asking his Father to escape, but promising his obedience, whatever the outcome. An angel appeared to steal his nerve, yet he was so overwhelmed with distress that he began to sweat blood. Jesus then woke his followers a final time. "Are you still asleep? Well, you've had all the rest you're going to get. On your feet, the time has come. See, look, the traitor approaches." As he spoke, an armed mob sent by the religious authorities appeared, led by Judas, who walked straight up to Jesus and kissed him. "No need for pretense, my friend," said Jesus quietly. "Just do what you've come to do." The kiss was a sign Jesus had given the mob, and they seized Jesus. "Am I a revolutionary all of a sudden?" asked Jesus. "Or a disturber of the peace, that you come for me armed to the teeth? Why not simply grab me in the temple?" "I've been there day after day, right under your noses, and you haven't lifted a finger against me. Instead, you waited for darkness to make your move." His followers began to panic, and one struck out with his sword at a servant of the Jewish high priest, cutting off his ear. "That's enough," Jesus said, reaching out his hand. He restored the ear as if the cut had never happened. "Violence leads to death, never life. If I wanted to use force, I could have summoned battalions of angels to my side, but everything must take its course, just as it was written long ago." At this, Jesus' followers turned tail and ran, melting into the shadows. The mob got hold of one, but he managed to wriggle free of his robe and fled naked into the night. The mob took Jesus to the home of the Jewish high priest, where the Jewish council had gathered. Jesus followed in the shadows and managed to slip into the courtyard of the house, where he joined a group of soldiers sitting around a fire. The religious leaders couldn't find a single piece of evidence against Jesus. They weren't short of people who were willing to trot out trumped-up charges against him, but even they contradicted each other. The whole thing was a sham. Finally, 2 men did manage to get their stories agreed. He boasted about destroying the temple and then rebuilding it in 3 days. Outside in the courtyard, one of the serving girls was staring at Peter. "You're one of Jesus' followers, aren't you?" she said. "I've no idea what you're talking about," Peter said loudly enough for them all to hear, and moved away. Another girl recognized him. Look, she said. "He was with Jesus." "You've got it all wrong," Peter swore. I never even met the man." A little later, they all challenged Peter. "Come off it," they said. "Your northern accent gives you away as one of Jesus' men." Peter began to swear and curse like a trooper. "How many times do I have to tell you? I don't know him." At that very moment, a cock crows. It rang out in the chill of the new dawn. Peter remembered what Jesus had said. Running out of the courtyard, he broke down and wept uncontrollably. As dawn broke, Jesus was taken before the hastily convened court of the Jewish leaders. Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, rounded on him. "What do you say to the charges against you?" he demanded. But Jesus remained silent until Caiaphas asked him outright, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" "Yes, I am," Jesus replied, "and one day you will see me at God's right hand and returning to earth on the clouds." This was all that Caiaphas needed. "Blasphemy!" he shouted, tearing his robes in blind fury. "What more proof do we need? He's guilty as charged." "His own words condemn him," the others shouted. "He must die." They flew at Jesus, screaming, spitting, and lashing out with their fists. He was blindfolded, and they began to beat him and mock him. "Come on, Son of God," they shouted. "Surely you can tell which one of us is hitting you." And then the guards took him away, and they too beat him. Having agreed that Jesus must die, the religious authorities handed him over to the Roman governor, a man called Pilate. The Jewish priests reeled off the charges against him, but Jesus remained resolutely silent, much to Pilate's amazement. "Do you hear what they're saying?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus said nothing. "They tell me you claim to be king of the Jews," he persisted. "Yes, I am," Jesus replied. "I can't find anything against this man," Pilate told the Jewish priests, but they continued to accuse him. "He's guilty of treason. He's a rabble-rouser, encouraging people not to pay the Roman taxes. He's been whipping up the people all the way from Galilee." When Pilate heard that Jesus came from Galilee, he saw a way of avoiding the issue. Galilee was under the control of Herod, the empire's puppet king of that region. So Pilate ordered Jesus to be taken to him. Herod was delighted. He had wanted to see Jesus for some time and hoped that he would perform a miracle or two. But despite a barrage of questioning, accusation, and abuse from the religious leaders, Jesus said not one word. Losing interest, Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. The two rulers had been enemies, but from that day they became allies. Pilate called all the religious leaders together and suggested a compromise. "You've done your best to convince me that this man's a dangerous revolutionary, but I haven't been able to find anything against him. Obviously, neither has Herod, or he wouldn't have sent him straight back here. This man doesn't deserve to die. Why don't I just give him a beating and then let him go?" But the religious leaders began to shout even more fiercely for Jesus to be put to death. 3 times Pilate tried to reason with them, but they drowned him out, shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" Pilate was no fool. He could see the envy which lay behind the charges against Jesus. He had one more card to play, a popular Passover tradition. He himself had established, and allowing the festival crowds to choose a prisoner to be set free. "Time to choose this year's prisoner," he called out to the people. "You can have Jesus, the one you call Saviour, or Barabbas." Barabbas was a real thug, and Pilate was sure they would choose Jesus. While the crowds were debating, Pilate received a note from his wife. "I've had bad dreams about this man. Don't get mixed up with him. He's innocent." But the religious leaders whipped up the crowd to demand that Barabbas be released. "Well," Pilate demanded, "have you made up your minds?" "Give us Barabbas," they shouted. "What about Jesus then?" asked Pilate. "What shall I do with him?" "Kill him," they bellowed. "Why, what's his crime?" Pilate replied. And there was no persuading them. "Crucify him," they yelled, over and over again. Pilate hadn't become governor without recognizing trouble when he saw it. He knew when to cut his losses and saw now that the only way to pacify the mob was to abandon Jesus to his fate. So he publicly washed his hands in front of them all. "I'm not responsible for what you do to this man," he said. "On our own heads be it," the crowd shouted. So Pilate had Jesus whipped and handed over to his troops, who took Jesus into their guardroom, stripped off his clothes, dressed him in scarlet robe. They twisted some thorn twigs together into a crude crown and stuck them upon his head. Kneeling in mock homage before him, they called out, "Hail, man, who would be king?" And after beating him severely and covering him in spittle, they put his clothes back on him and led him away to be crucified. When Judas realized that Jesus had been condemned to death, he was filled with remorse and tried to hand back his blood money back to the Jewish priests. "I've done a terrible wrong," he said. I betrayed an innocent man." "That's your problem," they replied, refusing to take the money. "It's nothing to do with us." So Judas flung the money at their feet and went outside and hanged himself. The Jewish priests gathered up the coins. "This money's tainted. We can't use it here." So they bought a local potter's field to be used as a graveyard for foreigners. It's still called Bloodacre today. The prophet Jeremiah had predicted this long ago. They put a price upon his head, 30 pieces of silver, and with it they bought the potter's field. Well, as they marched Jesus through the streets, the soldiers pulled a man out of the crowd and made him help Jesus, carrying his cross. His name was Simon, and he was a visitor who had come to Jerusalem from Cyrene for the Passover celebration. A large crowd followed, including many women, who wept as they saw Jesus. Turning to them, he said, "Don't cry for me, but for yourselves and for your children. If the world can do this to me, there is no limit to its evil." And Jesus was led to a place called the Skull, where they offered him wine to deaden the pain, which he refused. And as the soldiers stretched him out on the cross and drove nails through his feet and wrists, Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Lifting him up, they dropped the cross into its socket and then sat down to wait for him to die. As they waited, they played dice for his clothes. It was about 9 in the morning when they crucified Jesus between 2 thieves. The custom was to fix a notice above the victim's head, detailing their crime. The one above Jesus read, "The King of the Jews." The crowds who had come to see the killings taunted Jesus and shook their heads in scorn. "Well, look at this. The big talker who was going to pull down our temple and rebuild it in 3 days has got his comeuppance." The Jewish priests joining in, saying, "Fancy yourself as a saviour, do you? Ha! Looks like you can't even save yourself. If you really are the Son of God, prove it. Jump off that cross and then we'll believe in you." Even one of the criminals being crucified alongside him joined in the taunting and mockery, but the other one said, "What's got into you? He might have been sentenced to death, but whereas we deserve what's happening, he has committed no crime." Then he addressed Jesus. "Don't forget me when you become king," he pleaded. Jesus looked at him and said, "I give you my word. Today we'll be in paradise together." At around noon, the sun disappeared and an eerie darkness settled over the whole area. 3 hours later, Jesus lifted up his head and spoke out, "Oh God, why have you abandoned me?" And some of the bystanders thought he was calling out to Elijah, and someone stuck a sponge on a stick, soaked it with wine vinegar, and raised it to Jesus' lips. Others said, "Let him be, let's see what happens." Then Jesus called out, "Father, I entrust myself to your safekeeping." And Jesus cried out once more, let out his final breath, and died. The curtain blocking access to the most sacred part of the temple was torn in two, and an earthquake shook the land. Tombs burst open, and many holy people were raised from the dead. They went through the city and were seen by many witnesses. Seeing all this, a centurion in charge of the execution party exclaimed, "How could this man be guilty of any crime? He must have been God's son after all." The crowds were filled with fear and scurried away. But Jesus' followers stood at a safe distance, forlornly watching everything that happened. They included the women who had followed him so faithfully all the way from Galilee. One of the religious leaders was a rich man called Joseph. He was looking to see God's kingdom come and hadn't supported the decision to have Jesus killed. A prominent member of the Jewish council, he had secretly become a follower of Jesus and now saw an opportunity to play his part, however small. Jesus had been executed on the day before the day of rest, and Jewish law therefore required that his body be buried before sunset. So Joseph went to Pilate and asked for permission to bury the body. Pilate was initially suspicious, wondering if this was a ploy to rescue Jesus before he died. So he double-checked with the soldiers who had crucified with him. Satisfied that Jesus was truly dead, he agreed to Joseph's request. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in fresh linen and placed it in his own tomb, which he sealed by placing a large stone over the entrance. And some of the women followed and noted where he had been laid to rest. Now, it was Friday evening, so the women went home and prepared spices and oils to anoint the body. But they did nothing the next day because it was the day of rest. The next day, the religious authorities sought audience with Pilate. Before he died, this con man put about the fantasy that he would rise from the dead after 3 days, they said. So will you have the tomb sealed and guarded, at least until tomorrow? Otherwise, his followers might steal the body and claim that he has indeed come back to life. Imagine the trouble that would stir up. Take some of my troops to stand guard duty, said Pilate. Make that tomb as secure as a bank vault. And so they sealed the stone at the mouth of the tomb and set a guard outside. So it was on the first day of the week, the third day after Jesus was executed, that the women returned to the tomb, planning to tend to his body as custom required. and their only concern was that they wouldn't be able to roll the stone away from the entrance. When they arrived, however, they found the stone already moved, and the guards sprawled upon the ground as if dead, and the tomb empty. They went into the tomb and jumped with fright at the sight of an angel wearing a dazzling white robe. "Don't be scared," he said. "I know why you're here. You're looking for Jesus who was crucified, but you won't find him in a graveyard. He's alive, just as he promised. Look, you can see where the body lay. Go and tell the others that he'll be waiting for them in Galilee." And as the women rushed off, they ran into Jesus himself. Falling to the ground, they clung to his feet and worshipped him. "Don't be scared," he said. "Tell the others. I'll see them back in Galilee." And the women ran and told the men what they had seen and heard, but it didn't make sense to them. How could it be true? Peter raced to the tomb and peered inside, seeing only the pieces of linen lying on the floor. He walked away, trying to puzzle it all out. Some of the guards went and reported what had happened, and the religious leaders bribed the soldiers not to breathe a word of what had really occurred. "Tell everyone this story," they told them. "Say his followers must have come while we were asleep and stolen the body. If Pilate gets wind of it, we'll square it all with him." So the soldiers pocketed the money. That was giving them more crime than they needed. No, they pocketed the money and did as they were told. And their story is still doing the rounds today. Later that day, 2 of Jesus' followers were returning home to their village, Emmaus, a few miles outside Jerusalem. And as they mulled over everything that had happened in the last few days, Jesus joined them and walked along with them. And they didn't realize it was him. Who expects to see a dead man? He asked them, "What are you talking about?" And they were the very picture of dejection, all slumped shoulders and long faces. And one of them, Cleopas, said, "What planet have you been on these last few days? You must be about the only person alive who doesn't know what's been going on." "What's been going on?" asked Jesus innocently. "They've killed Jesus of Nazareth, that's what." "Oh, what a man! The things he said, the things he did. No one could have had the power that he had unless God sent him. And what did our so-called religious leaders do with him? Only handed him over to the Romans for crucifixion, that's what. And we pinned all our hopes upon him. We really believed that he was going to save the whole nation. The weird thing is, all this happened 3 days ago, and now some of our women are telling stories of angels at his tomb and saying that he's risen from the dead. Some of the men went to check it out, and they found the tomb empty. They found the tomb empty, all right, but saw neither hide nor hair of him." Jesus said, "Can't you put 2 and 2 together? It's all there in the ancient prophecies. God's prophets of old set it all down for you, detailing everything that would happen to the Messiah. And he began to point out every reference in the Jewish texts that had been written about himself. And when they reached the outskirts of their village, Jesus made as if to carry on, but it was already dusk, so they persuaded him to stay with them. Once supper had been served, Jesus took some bread and gave thanks to God and broke it and began to hand it to them. At once they knew who he was, but no sooner did they recognize him than he vanished. And turning to each other, they said, "No wonder we felt so fired up as he talked to us on the road." And leaving the meal untouched, they set out to walk back to Jerusalem, bursting into the room where Jesus' followers were gathered. And they were just in time to hear that Jesus had appeared to Peter. So they added their own experiences to the growing list of Jesus' appearances. And while they were swapping stories, Jesus suddenly appeared in the midst of them and said, "Peace be with you." And they were terrified, convinced that he was a ghost. "Don't be afraid," said Jesus. "Why did you doubt what I told you? See my hands and my feet. Here are the holes left by the nails. It's really me. Touch me if you like. What ghost was ever made of flesh and blood? Still they couldn't accept the truth, so he asked for some food and ate a piece of cooked fish before their eyes. Now Jesus' 11 original followers went to Galilee, as he had instructed them, and found him there, just as he had promised. And they worshipped him, although some still held on their doubts. And Jesus said, I have been given absolute authority. So now I commission you to go to the whole world, calling people everywhere to follow me. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and train them to obey my teaching. Don't worry, you'll never be alone again. I will be with you every step of the way to the very end of time. The end, or at least this bit of the story. May I encourage you to see if you can find who and read the rest. It's here in the book, and it's by Paul Langham, and it's published by Bible Society.